Now, importantly here, that in the West, they did talk about the Apostolic See as being the See of Rome, the Petrine See. But if you take Pope St. Gregory the First, or St. Gregory the Great, he's quite clear that the Petrine See isn't just the See of Rome. The Petrine See is one see with 3 bishops, that of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. And you see this even in the First Ecumenical Council when it talks about the priorities of Alexandria and Antioch. It bases them on Rome. Why? Because they are Petrine Sees as well. Each one is founded either by Peter or his disciple. So they are, all 3 are the one Petrine See. So it's not the case that just Rome is a Petrine. Alexandria and Antioch are also Petrine. They are the sees of Peter. And Antioch still recognizes this today, and so does Alexandria. So this is a problem. What happened to Rome is it becomes exclusively focused on Rome. Now, Rome does have a wider, higher, more universal jurisdiction than Alexandria and Antioch, so which is something we can go into. But nevertheless, they're all Petrine. So when it comes to being a rock, stability, the center of communion, all 3 are acting in that way. And you'll see even the Monophysites or the Copts and Ethiopians, they will stay around the Sea of Alexandria. And even the Church of India, when it broke off after Chalcedon, remembered the Patriarch of Antioch as the Patron Saint. They stayed in communion with the Patriarch of Antioch. It was the first see, as appropriately it should be. So it had its jurisdiction to the east. Alexandria had it in Africa. And then we get an interesting situation where Constantinople, out of nowhere, suddenly becomes co-equal with Rome, because it's new Rome. It is also takes on the privileges of Rome. That is the Petrine privileges. And it is one see with Rome. It is a see of Rome in a second location. And this is like Paul was not qualified to be apostle, but God pulled him out from wherever he was and made him co-equal with Peter as a prince of the apostles. In some ways, slightly greater, because he was an apostle to the Gentiles, where Peter was apostle to the Jews. So Paul almost takes on a slightly greater role, but he is co-equal. But yet, in the original qualification replacing Judas, he was not qualified to be an apostle. So this is the same in that you can object that Constantinople wasn't founded by Peter. Yes, it wasn't. But even then, God took Paul, he wasn't qualified to be apostle, and made him prince of the apostles alongside with Peter. So too, Constantinople is raised up to become prince, the first of the churches, alongside Rome, with all its privileges. So in a sense of its authority and privilege, it is Petrine. Not in its foundation. No, it wasn't founded by Peter. Some will argue it is founded by St. Andrew. But in its authority, it has the same authority as Rome. So when we're talking about Petrine authority, we must be careful that as far as St. Gregory the Great is concerned, it's not exclusively located in Rome. The Rome is a primary expression of that, and it's quite natural to talk about it as the first expression of that, but it's not the exclusive only expression of that. So we need to take all this into account when we're thinking about our rights and the privileges of the churches.
Yeah, and you were mentioning what St. Gregory the Great, where he refers to the 3 sees of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, all being of Peter. And so the importance of Rome exclusively, from the ecumenical councils, it's clear that it's because it's the imperial city. It's the capital of the empire. And also through tradition, it's also doubly apostolic through St. Paul as well, right?
So Rome, yes. Now, just to get that clarified, Rome is set as first by the will of God. That's fine. Peter and Paul go there. That was important to recognize that Rome was to be the first place. It is recognized as first place because it's established as such by the apostles Peter and Paul. And it is specifically called Petrine as a symbol from the Gospels of its leadership, as too as Alexandria and Antioch. So this is all God's will, the apostles' will. Why do they choose Rome? Because it liked the river Tiber? Because it happened to be a nice hills it was sitting on? No. They chose it because it was a capital city of the empire. It was where all roads go to Rome. It was the sea most visible to all. It had all the best communications. Therefore, it was sensible that when you have a church of the Gentiles, Rome was symbolically the first city of the Gentiles, of the nations. Rome was sort of, the empire was considered a gathering or unity of all the nations. Okay, it didn't actually control all nations, but it carried a symbol of the unity of all nations. And so it was a place for the first see, which is the chief testimony to the empire, to the nations, should be where the emperor was in Rome. Therefore, it's one of the most influenced with the empire and one of the greatest testimony. All roads, everyone sees what's happening in Rome. Everyone can follow its customs, etc. There's no point picking at some little place in the middle of nowhere. So there's a reason that they went there. It was because it was the capital of the empire. Not that the capital of the empire, but the desire to make that the first see was from Christ, from the apostles, and there is an Petrine inheritance given to that see, which transcends the continuing relative status of the city in the empire for the generations to come. It was a map. It was an initial starting point to pick the See of Rome, but after that, it wasn't dependent on the empire in continuation. So that's why Rome stays the first see even after the city is sacked, falls, separated from the empire about 750 AD. It continues on as the first see because that's part of the tradition of the church. It maintains that despite the empire. So that was really important. But this is also why, though it's Christ's will, is not because the emperor decided to do so. It is not simply to conform to the empire as the sake of conforming to empire and just continue with the empire, as I stated. And this is a church structure based on the where Rome was at the time, because that was an appropriate spot for the first see to be appointed. But interestingly, because it was Rome as the capital city, when Constantine made Constantinople New Rome, in other words, he identified it with Rome, it's the same capital as Rome, the fathers went, well, the apostles gave the priority of the first church to Rome because it was a capital city. So it goes to Rome, not because it was the city on the Tiber, it's not because of its geographical location, it's because it was the capital of the empire. And when Constantine identified Constantinople with Rome as New Rome, as the capital empire, then the fathers went, well, hold on a minute, the apostles and Christ decided that the seat at the capital empire, which happened to be Rome, it happened to be on the Tiber, it was to be made a first seat and have all the privileges of Peter. Well, this new city, which is Rome, and all identity in that, must therefore also receive the same privileges as old Rome, because it is the reason for giving it to Rome is now true also of Constantinople. It is Rome. It is the capital of the empire. Therefore, the bishop here, to follow obedience of Christ and the apostles, must receive the privileges of Peter, because it is the reason for giving it to old Rome. It's the same here. So it's the same logic. So therefore, that's why they gave them the same privileges. They said they're equal, though it recognizes it second, so you don't end up with two-headed empire sort of thing. The Rome becomes sort of the prototype, and it's an image of that. but it's the same, takes the image of the privilege because it was the see of Rome. Though few people seem to get that, but that means it has all the equal privileges of Rome. It is Rome. And so in the Orthodox Church today, Constantinople stands as the see of Rome, did for the first 300 years, and did really until the schism. We haven't lost anything of the authority of Rome amongst the churches today in its continuation in Constantinople. And that's why it always keeps saying New Rome. It's a see of Rome as far as we're concerned, in all practical things. So whatever we say about the see of Rome in the first millennium, it's true of Constantinople. It's only in the first millennium Old Rome had a certain priority for unity of New Rome, but when Old Rome fell into heresy, New Rome continues exactly the same authority, exactly the same position in the churches, among the churches. So yeah, the Orthodox Church has lost nothing of what was given to Rome by Peter. And in this sense, yes, New Rome is a Petrine Sees and carries all the authority of Peter, and it has stayed for the next 1,000 years as solid rock. I mean, there's some issues going on now, but nevertheless, Old Rome had certain issues as well, so that's okay. We can live with those little niggles.
Okay, so Father, you were talking about the privileges given to Constantinople as being equal with Rome. Now, I believe this comes directly from an ecumenical council, right?
Yes. This is first affirmed at the Second Ecumenical Council, where they recognize as Constantinople as having equal honor to Rome, because it was New Rome, but also recognized as coming second after her. So it still recognized a certain priority to Old Rome, but otherwise having equal privilege, same honor. And then at the Council of Chalcedon, the famous Canon 28 just goes into more depth about the equality, why it's equality, what the equality means, and then it also rebukes Constantinople for taking too much authority of that and respecting the proper authority of the metropolitans underneath to do ordinations of their own bishops, and smacking his hand for interfering with that and saying you can only ordain the metropolitans, it's not your job to do, but the bishops underneath. This is a structural, hierarchical structure I was talking about, the Metropolitan Council being the most important aspect of that. This is why I think recently, over the last century, the changes in the Constantinople, this is actually contrary to the ecumenical canons and the structures of the church. But maybe there's certain necessity due to population sizes, but nevertheless, the restructuring was a disaster in terms of relation to the holy canons and the structure of the church. So anyway, Canon 28 just reinforced the equality of Rome and New Rome and just gave more expression why that was the case. But it was actually purposed at constraining the authority of Constantinople vis-a-vis the metropolitan and bishops. And in the Sixth Ecumenical Council reinforces the structure and the order of the churches of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and thereon after. Jerusalem is as a patriarch, but it's not Petrine Sees per se. It is a see of honor for its the heritage of the see of St. James, etc. So it has an honor afterwards, but it's not strictly Petrine as such. It's not one that's founded by Peter. And then we have other patriarchs, but they take subsequent order after that and have limited jurisdiction. So again, they're not Petrine per se, but they are a way of managing churches in different regions, which would be too difficult to maintain under the patriarchs having to approve every ordination.
Yeah, and since you mentioned St. Cyprian in that last segment, I just want to go back to somewhere he talks about with the keys given to St. Peter, and he connects that to the founding of the church upon the bishops itself. So Peter is like this symbol of receiving the keys, and he represents the bishops. So yeah, I don't know if you anything to add to that.
Yeah, no, that's right. St. Cyprian does recognize a higher order of the sees, the metropolitans, the exarchs, and the patriarchs. Carthage was like an exarchate in there. It had its own metropolitans under different regions. So it was a very senior see. But it to recognize Rome, but it had a certain independence from Rome, or autonomy from Rome as well. Yes, so, but again, he just reinforces what I was saying before, that the primary sense of the patron thing is the bishops, because that the whole church is present with Christ and the apostles in each place, with Peter as the one who is singled out to present Christ among the apostles. That's what we see in each diocese. But we shouldn't. Bobbio is an important Petrine role beyond the diocese. And that is why we have Rome as a Petrine see along with Alexandria and Antioch. This is important to the structure of churches. It's part of our tradition. It is not the same high priestly ministry function. That's purely true of all the dioceses. This is another type of function which has a certain different type of relationship, much more equal relationship, because of the authority of those in the relationship is much higher. So yeah, there's multiple layers of this Petrine ministry as such.
Yeah, and like you were mentioned earlier, I mean, Saint Cyprian specifically rejects the idea of having a bishop of bishops.
Yes, he's very clear on that, and this is what the Roman model effectively is a bishop of bishops.